What's up, free thinkers and true believers? Welcome to a theological dust-up and another episode of Free Think or Die, hosted by Freethinking Ministries. I'm Dr. Tim Stratton, and with me today is somebody who I've looked up to for many years and who's helped me sharpen my thinking on some philosophical and theological issues. Our guest today is, in my opinion, the epitome of a scholar, a fantastic philosopher, with a beautiful mind, and it seems to me that he's also got the heart of a pastor. Although our guest today has been hailed as the world's foremost expert on all things related to the moral argument for the existence of God, this guy was never too busy to have several long conversations with me when I was just a mere up-and-comer, as it were, with no letters behind my name. With that said, it's simply an honor to have Dr. David Baggett on the show with us today. Hey, thanks for being here today, Dave.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. And Tim, it's a real pleasure. I've been looking forward to this for some time.
Oh,
And
well,
I look up to you. You used to be a young whippersnapper, but now you're the big wig, big shot. And so it's all my pleasure and privilege to be with you.
Well, nothing has ever been more false. Right off the bat, we're disagreeing with each other.
That sets a good tone.
Yeah, that's right. Well, this is going to be fun. Dave, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Oh, I'm teaching at Houston Baptist University with my wife, Mary Beth, who's a professor of English and cultural apologetics. And pretty soon, actually, she's going to be becoming the chairperson of the apologetics department. And so that'll be fun. Yeah. So she'll kind of be my boss. And she has plenty of experience bossing me around already. So that's going to be just hunky-dory.
The boss at home and the boss at work. So there's no escape. No, that sounds good, though. I didn't know that. That's going to be fun.
Yeah.
All right. So you are well known. Like I said, some have called you. In fact, other experts in the field have called you the expert on the moral argument. So let's talk about this moral argument. For those who might be new to this issue, can you give us kind of a brief overview of the moral argument?
Yeah, well, so the moral argument basically, right, is designed to show that there are various moral phenomena in this world that cry out for a good explanation, an adequate explanation, and preferably a robust explanation. And that if you carefully consider this evidence, there's principled reason to think that it's going to point in the direction of God. Now, it seems to me that right off the bat, when someone hears that, they haven't yet really heard many specifics, of course, but they'll be skeptical oftentimes because they'll think, number one, well, morality, for crying out loud, I mean, what does that have to do with God? I can believe what I want to believe about morality. It's up to me. It's subjective. You hear a lot of people say that. And so it's just not clear to them why invoking God is remotely relevant. And so this is quite an interesting phenomenon nowadays that I'm running into, this sort of prima facie resistance right off the bat. But I largely think it's a function of not looking carefully at the evidence. One of the real intellectual virtues that we ought to be cultivating is attentiveness to evidence, and then, of course, being willing to follow the evidence where it leads.
Yeah.
And the moral evidence, I think, nowadays tends to get domesticated so much that people think there's really nothing to it. Right. So if you reduce morality just to kind of, your personal preference, kind of like what you might like to think is right or wrong or whatever, but it's really up to you. And ultimately, there's nothing to it beyond your own personal preferences and predilections. Well, then, of course, you don't need God.
Yeah.
But the simple fact is, if you think about morality, you think about what's wrong with cutting the limbs off a child and raping it until the child is dead. Wow. What's wrong with that? That's not a matter of opinion, right? It's a matter of objective fact, for crying out loud, right? Where does the intrinsic value of human persons come from? Where does the essential equality of people come from? Why is it that we ought to love our neighbors as we love ourselves? Where does the authority of moral obligations come from? These things require a good explanation, you know? So this is what I encourage people to do who think that it's a no-brainer that the moral argument can't even get off the ground. Actually, pay attention, pay closer attention to the evidence. This is what I
Mm.
really strongly suggest people do.
Hmm. Pay attention to the evidence. Yeah, that's good advice. I I've found that when I'm on university campuses, that the moral argument seems to be the most powerful argument to share. Uh, in some instances, maybe the kalam or the fine tuning. Maybe if you're in the science department, but so many people have more. We make moral judgments every single day, and so appealing to the moral argument seems to be very powerful. But with that said, uh, let's think about it this way. Suppose you're about to board an elevator, and as you're getting on this elevator, you hear somebody uh, else who's getting on the elevator say something like this. They say, "I just wish I had evidence for the existence of God." And you guys get on the elevator together, and you're like, "Oh, now I've got you." So, what is your elevator speech version of the moral argument? And keep this in mind: it's a skyscraper, and it's kind of a slow moving elevator. So, you got a little more time. But yeah, what's your elevator speech?
Okay. Well, I'm probably not the best guy to ask about this elevator speech deal. You give me a short, pithy version of it. I'll give you the long-winded,
Right.
boring version. Uh, but if you want something a little more succinct and concise, I can try. But by the way, you said something that reminded me. When William Lane Craig goes to college campuses, he says the same thing, that this is the argument that has the most effect.
Yeah.
Even though it's not his personal favorite, he
Right.
tends to gravitate toward the cosmological argument.
Yeah.
And then Al Plantinga, similarly, when asked of the various arguments in natural theology, which one does he think is the best? He actually points to the moral argument as well.
Does he really?
Yeah, so arguably the greatest living Christian philosopher and apologist agree
Yeah.
on the power of the moral argument. So that's not
Yeah.
a bad place to start.
Well, just really quickly before you give me your elevator speech, I'll just add to what you're saying by noting just this year when we launched our apologetics ministry I help with the Reasonable Faith chapter and the Ratio Christi chapter at the University of Nebraska at Kearney. And so we had this booth, during the back to school bash or whatever it's called. And we had this booth set up with this big board that said, "Is racism objectively wrong?" And wow, that started so many great conversations. One clear thinking atheist marked no, it's not. And now he said, of course, he doesn't like racism and that he's not a racist himself, but he's like, "Oh, but since I don't think God exists, there's nothing objectively wrong with racism." And so you can imagine the conversations that sparked.
Yeah. Well, yeah, there's a few things about that are worth noting. My goodness, yeah. So yeah, it's sad, of course, to me to hear that atheist said that,
Yeah,
because I would have rather them said, "Of course it's wrong," because then you
right.
have
Most
something,
did. Most of them
right?
did. Yeah,
Yeah, because then you have something to discuss, and now you can say,
yeah,
"No, let's think about what features of the world make best sense of that," right?
yeah, yeah.
But this goes back to Nietzsche. Nietzsche predicted that the death of God would not result in immediate moral skepticism, that it was going to take generations before people began to feel the force of the death of God,
Wow.
of an atheistic worldview. And he's right. And this is very much, the Enlightenment kind of endeavor to kind of get rid of God, but hold on to these things like morality as if it doesn't matter. For a few centuries this is what many people have been trying to do, but Nietzsche predicted that in time eventually there would be more and more moral skeptics as people began to realize the futility of the task.
Hmm.
And so what I've said for a good long while is that kind of radical skepticism, which is still a distinctly minority view, so I'm not surprised to hear what you said, that this was
Yeah.
the only one, but unfortunately I do think it's going to grow.
Hmm.
Um, and it's going to be harder to reach people at that point because there's again less common ground to share and to generate a conversation. Now, on the other hand, there's sort of endorsing about half of the moral argument
Yeah.
in that
Right.
rejection,
Hmm.
right? But one person's modus ponens is another's modus tollens. I'm afraid that
Yeah.
instead of accepting God, they're going to reject morality, and
Right.
that's a
Yeah.
troublesome situation. But you really have to reject so much of your humanity, when you start to say things like rape isn't wrong, or racism isn't wrong. Usually nowadays, that's one of those things, racism, that is, that even otherwise skeptical people are still adamant on, like, well, maybe nothing else is right or wrong, but racism, we know that it's just
Yeah.
the moment that we live in, you know what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So most people haven't given up on morality altogether and across the board, and I still think that gives us a real window of opportunity to have conversations with our secular friends. This does remind me, back when I lived in Virginia, my wife and I spent an evening at Poplar Forest. This was Thomas Jefferson's vacation home, actually in Lynchburg, Virginia, about an hour from Charlottesville. And it's built on the same kind of model as Monticello. So it looks just like Monticello, except it's a miniature version.
Wow.
In fact, when I moved to Lynchburg, people said, yeah, Thomas Jefferson had a vacation home in Lynchburg. So I'd like drive around and I'd be like looking at houses thinking, I wonder if that was Thomas Jefferson's house. And
Wow.
it's like a duplex built in 1970. Yeah, no. When I finally saw like Poplar Forest, it's like this little miniature Monticello. It was like, okay, so that would be it.
Yeah.
Anyway, one evening they had a lecture there, and one of the gals there on the panel taught art history at the University of Virginia, and she happened to be a Black woman, and she was up there talking about she was kind of one of these critical race folks,
Yeah.
but she was talking about how everything is power. There's really no such thing as truth. Everything is just power and perspective, and that sort of thing. And so I raised my hand at the end, and I challenged that, and I invoked slavery. I said, "Well, surely you would agree that that was wrong," thinking that
Mhm.
might be one of those non-negotiables,
Yeah.
even for her. And she said, uh, "Wrong for whom?"
Mm.
Right? It might be wrong for some, but not wrong for others, right? Wrong
Yeah.
for the slave, but not wrong for the slaveholder, and so forth. And I was just astounded. And but well, this is often what you're getting nowadays, I suppose, in
Yeah.
certain contexts. Now that's a sad situation.
Right. I do think most people, like you said, will do understand. They have this direct acquaintance with the moral fabric of the universe, I guess. And,
Yeah.
and if you think about it, it seems to me that at least most people uh, might you might be able to convince them that objective morality is more real than the physical universe, because it seems to me that hardly anybody's going to deny that physical reality exists, but there are a few. And there's some philosophers who make the case that physical reality doesn't exist, and they'll invoke the matrix and things like that. But even in the matrix, it seems like there were some things that were really right and wrong. Even if physical reality didn't exist, there was still some things that were really evil in a world where physical reality didn't exist. And so if you run that kind of a thought experiment, it seems that morality is more objective, or at least that we might have a greater insight into the objective moral fabric of reality, even more so than we do with the physical universe. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, when I worked on my book Good God some years ago, it's been about a dozen years now. At that time, I didn't even take up much the question of moral realism, because I just sort of assumed that everyone down deep, or most everyone down deep, is a moral realist,
Right.
And in a real way, I think that's probably true. Protestations, to the contrary, notwithstanding, by some. There are some absolutely consistent hardline moral skeptics, but most people, when push comes to shove, will
Mhm.
realize that there are at least some.
Yeah.
There are at least some. I mean, the cancellation of Firefly after 13 episodes. Who on earth, Tim, could say that that was not evil? Right? You know what I'm talking about,
Yeah, there's some things are just really wrong no matter what
right?
anybody thinks. So so with that in mind, let's get back on that elevator.
Yeah. So, okay. One big question would be, what sort of God are they thinking about, right?
Okay.
Yeah, because if they think of God as just big and powerful or something like that, the moral argument's not necessarily going to speak to them very much. But if they're thinking of God, in the sort of classical monotheistic terms or something like that, where God is all good and all loving and
Mhm.
this sort of thing, then the moral argument, it seems to me, potentially could do a lot of good to get them thinking. Now, if my time is limited with them, what I would probably do is key in on the one sort of version of the moral argument that I think most quickly and easily lends itself to proclaiming the Christian gospel. And there is one version of the moral argument that brings you right there
Okay.
in a direct line. And so I'd probably start with that one. And it's related to John Hare's work. Now, John Hare, son of R.M. Hare, famous atheist of the 20th century. John is a Christian and he teaches at Yale. What a wonderful man.
Mm.
And talk about, guy who knows most about the moral argument. It's not me. It's probably him or
Really?
Robert Adams. Oh, yeah.
Wow.
So, but yeah, John Hare is a marvelous thinker and has written a number of books. And one of the books is called The Moral Gap. And the moral gap deals with a few Kantian versions of the moral argument. And one of them we can call the performative variant or the argument from grace. That's actually what Hare calls it. So I like that. I like that language, the argument from grace. And okay, and so the basic idea, I'm not yet talking to the guy on the elevator,
Okay.
by
Okay.
the way.
You're setting up the
I'm
elevator.
setting up.
Yeah.
I'm explaining why I would approach it this way. Could you imagine? At this point, the elevator doors would open and the person would like jump out. Yeah. So in Hare's work on the moral gap, he talks about the ways in which we can address this gap that exists between the best that we can do and the moral standard, right? Which is kind of uncompromising. He says we could, of course, just lower the moral demand. That's one way to try to close the gap, but he's not open to that, right? Because he really thinks that morality is real and it imposes these demands upon us, and that needs to be taken seriously, right? And but this is very much a trend nowadays. Is like I said before, sort of reductionist and deflationary, domesticated versions of morality that are much easier to explain, right? But if you really take morality with the utmost seriousness, lowering the moral demand isn't really an option. And then Hare points out you could also try to close the gap by exaggerating our capacities, act like we can be better than we are. But he says, following Kant, that if you're really honest about, our tendencies to fall short of the moral standard, that's not really an option either.
Hmm.
So he thinks that we need some kind of assistance in order to close the gap because we can't do it on our own. And this is where he invokes the notion of God's grace. And I like that very much. And so when I talk about this version of the moral argument, I actually expand it out, not just to talk about that gap between the best we can do and what morality demands, but to actually address three issues. And all of them, I think, are deeply felt existential moral needs that we have as human beings.
Hmm.
First, recognizing that we fall short of the moral demand, we need to be forgiven. And then we need to be changed. I mean, deeply transformed, and not just incrementally, but radically. And ultimately, we want to be, don't we, completely delivered from, as a Christian would put it, the power of sin. But, those ugly aspects of our character and such that stand in the way of our being the best versions of ourselves that we could be. And as it happens, Christianity impeccably provides the solution to all three of these needs.
Hmm.
Our having fallen short, God offers us forgiveness and has made provision for us to be forgiven. And then by God's Holy Spirit, He strengthens us and changes us and gradually transforms us to be the people that He wants us to be.
Yeah.
And He doesn't just take us a certain way down that road. Eventually, He promises and imbues within us a hope that won't disappoint, to make us perfect, to transform us entirely, right? To
Hmm.
deliver us completely from the power of sin, conform us entirely to the image of Jesus, and this sort of thing. So our deep existential moral needs for forgiveness and for transformation and for perfection are all found in Christianity. So
Hmm.
I would talk about that way in which all of us tend to fall short of the moral standard. I'm talking to the elevator guy now.
Okay, yeah, the doors are
Poor
closing.
elevator guy. Yeah, the doors are closing. But I would broach that topic of the way in which we all fall short, and I wouldn't be like, you have fallen short. I would talk about, the way in which I fall short of the moral standard. Of course, at this point, the person might be thinking, "Why is this person talking to me?" But I would continue on unabated.
So let me ask you this: in real world conversations,
Yeah.
are you the type of guy that gives a syllogism? Premise one, premise two, therefore,
No,
or okay,
no, I don't. No,
okay,
I don't. I don't care for that. Um, yeah, because I think that the richness of the material um, is such that a syllogism conveys the wrong impression oftentimes.
Mm,
But I've been criticized by this for this by the way by some who want that. They give me the premise. Premise
right,
one, premise two. Um, but personally, I would much rather be involved in a conversation in which
yeah,
you are able to share the richness of these ideas and give them some texture along the way, because that often gets filtered out
right,
from syllogisms. Yeah, so I talk about the moral standard and how C.S. Lewis thought that there were two basic facts about the world that kind of gave us a deep insight into the nature of reality, into the nature of the universe and of ourselves. That there's a standard, and that
hmm,
we fall short of it. It's the same structure, right? So just quickly introduce people to that, and it really does remind them, I think, of three felt needs that we all have. To be forgiven for the wrongdoing that we've done. And again, I would talk about my own wrongdoing because that's a little bit more uh, you know, uh, disarming than you're a sinner and need forgiveness. And then how God wants to change us and transform us, and ultimately deliver us entirely, from those aspects of our character that are ugly and that are
yeah,
vicious, and so forth. So there's so which is all of which to say, you'll notice this is very much just like sort of sharing with someone the gospel, isn't it?
yeah,
So this particular
right,
version of the moral argument lends itself impeccably to proclaiming the gospel,
mm,
and in that way, the moral argument really does, I think, function as a beautiful kind of prelude or precursor
yeah.
to proclamation of the gospel. So that's one variant of the moral argument. And if I had just a few minutes with a guy on an elevator, that's probably where I'd go.
I love it. For some reason, I seem to be the kind of guy that loves syllogisms. And so when I'm trying to connect the dots or to figure things out, I want to see that syllogism. But I have realized that I'm in the minority and that most people, if you're going to be in an elevator or have a cup of coffee with somebody, they don't like to think things through like that. So I think you're right, that most people probably don't need that. They need a real conversation.
Well, I um, I have my preference, but there's nothing wrong with your preference. I mean, really, it just seems to me that each of us is called to just be ourselves,
Yeah, right.
and I don't think you need to change a thing. Um, I remember when I decided I wanted to become a philosophy professor, the biggest thing that stood in my way was that I had such a high regard and esteem for my own philosophy professors, and I always found myself thinking, I can't do what they do. They can't be
Huh,
them, you know.
yeah.
But it was almost like it finally dawned on me, I don't have to be them. I'm not called to be
Yeah.
them, I'm just called to
Right.
be me.
Yeah.
And that goes for each and every one of us. So, some people, I mean, my friend Sloan Lee, I mean, he dreams syllogisms. I'm sure of it. He's the master at putting these
Yeah.
things into syllogistic form, and
Yeah.
I love Sloan. His mind works in a particular way, and he's just a magician of rigor, and
Mm,
uh, that's great too.
yeah. Yeah. We're all wired differently, and that
That's
makes
right.
this world a beautiful place.
That's right.
All right. Well, if you don't mind, I thought it'd be kind of fun to discuss the connection, I guess, between our two fields of study. I think there's a bit of an overlap. And to tell you the truth, that's why I've paid so much attention to your work over the years, and why I've contacted you several times in the past to make sure that I'm not too far out in left field. I mean, I do love to play left field, but you don't want to go too far out into left field. Interestingly, when I played baseball in high school, that was my position. Usually, I played left field. So, but as you know, I argue that humans possess libertarian free will or libertarian freedom when it comes to thinking. And then I argue that that provides a foundation for rational responsibility and opportunities to infer better and true beliefs over false beliefs, and the ability to gain knowledge via the intentional use of reason, and then also the ability to rationally infer claims of knowledge. I've written a book about that. So in that book, I contend then that rational responsibility provides the foundation for moral responsibility. And so then I make the connection and I say, look, if that's the case, the Christian apologist who rejects human libertarian freedom because they assume that God causally determines all things all the time, right? That person who rejects libertarian free will does not have logically consistent access to the moral argument. All right, so I say, well, look, you can still give the argument, but look, the atheist might turn it around on you once they know your actual position and say you don't have logically consistent access to the argument you're trying to convince me with. So anyway, I argue that Christians should affirm libertarian free will and reject exhaustive divine determinism. And then by doing this, they now have logically consistent access to the moral argument for God's existence. So with all that said, what do you think, Dave? With objective moral values and duties in mind, does it even make sense to offer the moral argument if one believes that God causally determines all thoughts, all beliefs, all actions, all behaviors all the time, and thus no human ever possesses an opportunity to think or act otherwise? Does that make sense?
Well, I think it. I think it does. I've been trying really hard for years not to pick fights with my Calvinist friends, because I used to do that all the time. It made me very unpopular, and I appreciate your forcing my hand to talk about this. Oh man, yeah. Well, I know our Calvinist friends disagree with us and all, but yeah, if you're just asking for my own opinion, right here and right now. Yeah, my view is very similar. That if you're a thoroughgoing Calvinist, and the only freedom that you really believe in is a sort of compatibilist freedom, according to which we do what we want to do or something like that, but you couldn't do otherwise, then it seems to me that the gospel is not very good news for the non-elect, because it's not like I mean, my view that they freely reject the gospel. They invariably reject it. They couldn't do otherwise. Now that's based on my analysis of freedom as a libertarian, like you, though. And of course, they would just say, well, we believe in a different kind of freedom. But my thinking on that is maybe doing what you want to do is necessary for freedom, but it's not sufficient. Surely it's not sufficient. Right. And I think there are all sorts of thought examples that illustrate that with perfect clarity. Well, so on my view, we do need God's grace, right? So we don't have the kind of libertarian freedom that's Pelagian or semi-Pelagian or anything like that.
Right.
We do need God's grace,
Yes.
and that, of course, is a common misunderstanding of this sort of affirmation of libertarian freedom, that it somehow vitiates the need for God's grace. And that's not our position at all. No, we need God's grace. Like we were talking about before, we need God's grace to be forgiven and to be changed and to be transformed and to be perfected. And ultimately that perfection is going to be the deepest sort of freedom that there is of all, right? Freedom from sin itself. So on my view, there is a close connection between meaningful libertarian free will and a workable moral argument. If I were giving the moral argument as a Calvinist to myself, I would be all conflicted. But in response to myself, I would say So can you explain again, your view on God's grace and why exactly the gospel is good news here? Because if someone is outside of that group that's going to be conferred God's effectual grace, there is no way that they can accept the offer of salvation, right?
Yeah.
So it's not good news for them. I mean, and in fact, hell isn't even tragic for them, I think, on a Calvinist view. I mean, it's just what God intends.
Right.
Uh, the only way to avoid that, it seems to me, is for folks just to sort of speak outside of out of both sides of their mouth at the same time. Like, well, God's genuinely offering them this possibility. But look, if your hands are tied behind your back and I offer you something and I say, look, I'm offering it to you, take it. And you're like, I can't. My hands are tied behind my back. I'm like, hey, whatever. I offered it. It wasn't a genuine offer, it seems to me.
Mhm.
So yeah, I think that some people who haven't thought about this as much as they should gravitate toward Calvinism simply because they think that this is the position that you need to take once you recognize our radical need for God's grace. And that's a mistake.
Mhm.
Yes, we need God's grace, but that does not mean that you need to embrace a compatibilist and Calvinist view of these matters. And in fact, it seems to me, it raises serious questions about God's nature, God's love, God's goodness. It raises a serious question of if God is the author of sin. And the moral argument, it seems to me, is really difficult to advance in that sort of context. And I also think it makes the problem of evil intractable. That said, you know, if my Calvinist brothers and sisters are genuinely convinced of their views and that sort of thing, all the power to them. I embrace them and fellowship with them, as you do. We just have a real parting of the ways on some of those issues. But what I did decide to do a few years ago, Tim, this is the first time in years I've even talked about this, is I just set it aside. Honestly, the whole Calvinist approach, I think it's so wrong and so obviously wrong and inconsistent with the best exegesis that we have of Scripture, and absolutely a train wreck philosophically.
Mhm.
I simply set it aside and I focus positively on the way I think it actually goes. Right? God
Mhm.
actually is a God of love. The gospel really is good news. If anybody ends up in hell, it really is truly tragic, and it didn't have to be that way.
Right.
And I just focus on who God actually is on my view. And anybody who reads my stuff, that can read between the lines and see exactly where I'm coming from. But I don't explicitly take on these other views for the most part, except I still will tend to point out that you have a very similar challenge to pose against our secular friends who are determinists, right?
Yeah.
Because if they want to take morality seriously, they have the exact same challenge. I mean,
Right.
how can you
Exactly
take
right.
morality seriously if we're causally determined to behave in just the
Mhm.
way that we do? If
Yep.
every thought, if every deed that we ever do is causally determined and couldn't have been otherwise, I mean, we're complicated organic machines.
Yeah.
And how on earth does that conduce to our being meaningful moral agents? And yet some of them try to bite the bullet and make sense of that. Others, I think, more honestly, just say, yeah, it doesn't make sense. And I'm
Mhm.
giving up categories like retributive justice and whatnot, and I'll just
Yeah.
stick with deterrence and rehabilitation and the like. Um, anyway, a real analogous challenge there.
Well, I really appreciate that, Dave, and I guess I'll take that as kind of a stamp of approval from you because sometimes there's been some philosophers, one in particular, who's really been pressing me, saying that I didn't really understand what I was talking about in that final chapter of my book, where I was trying to make that connection between libertarian freedom and the moral argument. So yeah, I feel somewhat vindicated and validated with your words there. So thank you
For
for
what it's
sharing.
worth, I'm with you,
Cool.
100%.
Thank you. All right. Well, now I'd like to ask you about your thoughts on something that I do. I often appeal to something called purpose theory in an attempt to ground at least some form of objective morality apart from human opinion. And so I often say things like, well, if God created humanity on purpose and for a specific purpose, then there would be objective facts about humanity, irrespective of the subjective opinions from humanity. And then I often explain that Jesus then placed humanity in an epistemic position to know the objective purpose of humanity, which is basically to love God and others. And then I say, to a degree that we approximate to the mark, right, the objective purpose of human existence, to that same degree, we're objectively good. And to a degree that we miss the mark, to that same degree, we sin and are objectively bad. Now, again, I play left field, so I'm sure my line of reasoning could be improved upon. So I would love to have you tighten down some loose ends and set me straight.
Well, I don't think there's any need for me to set you straight. I think everything that you're saying is right, and I think it's all part of a big picture. And
Yeah.
so yeah, I think all of those things are aspects of that picture that I would readily affirm. I think it's quite good. What you're gesturing toward, of course, is something like a teleological understanding of human
Yes.
beings. So God created us for these reasons and purposes. That's right. Yeah, and that's crucial, vitally important to understand. It seems to me that on a Christian understanding of things, right? Yeah, we've been made by God in His image for reasons and for purposes, and there are aspects common to the human condition that impose constraints and strictures on how it is that we ought to live and behave, and there are objective facts about these matters, and that's an ineliminable part of the human moral condition. I think that's right. Um, Now that said, I tend to be kind of eclectic when it
Mm.
comes to the sense in which I'm a theistic ethicist, in that I really like to listen to a broad array of perspectives on these matters, and I kind of learn something from everybody practically,
Yeah.
so I can listen to a teleologist,
Mm.
and I can be reminded of this sort of this sort of thing of which you speak, and I can listen to a divine command theorist,
Mhm.
and I'm often then reminded of aspects of morality from that dimension, that God may well tell us to do something, and we don't entirely know why He tells us, and He
Okay.
could have told us to do something different. I sometimes think about the tithing, like He said at one point, so give me 10% of your income. I don't necessarily think that was a function of human nature such that it had to be 10%. You know what I mean?
Mm.
Probably He could have said 12%.
Right.
Maybe if we had 12 fingers, He would have said 12%. Um, but divine will theorists and divine motivation theorists, divine command theorists, natural law theorists, these teleologists, all of these, I think, provide some crucial insights into the nature of the dependence relation of morality on God. And as a moral apologist, and this dawned on me at a certain point, because I used to sort of engage in these little battles, uh, as a theistic ethicist against other theistic ethicists, and then I realized, what am I doing fighting with these folks? I mean, we tend to agree.
Yeah.
We're just maybe disagreeing a little bit on some of the fine grained details. The point is, we both agree on a fundamental dependence relation of crucial aspects of morality on God. And as a moral apologist, it dawned on me, well, that's all I need, to
Mm.
kind of get the ball rolling to advance the moral argument. So maybe I can spend less time arguing, with fellow theists who might spell that dependence relation out a little bit differently, and instead kind of join arms with them,
Yeah.
and together we can do moral apologetics,
Mm.
you know. But I really do think that practically every one of the approaches that I mentioned there reminds you of some crucial aspect of a very rich picture that involves God and us and authoritative obligations and essential human worth and the purpose that we're here for, and all the rest. Maybe one little addition that I might wish to emphasize is this: that it's not just to the things that we hold in common as human beings. That's crucial, that's really
Mhm.
important, you know but I'm also open to, Tim Stratton is Tim Stratton. There's something specific and individual and particular about you, right? Philosophers
Mm.
talk about the aseity, of an
Right.
individual,
Yeah.
right? So nobody else instantiates Tim Strattonus except you, and likewise, I'm my own particular self, and everyone is. And there's that image in Revelation, and John Hare likes to talk about this, of the white stone on which is written a name, and it's sort of a secret between you and
Mm,
God. And his view is that captures some of that specificity about you, what God created you as and to do. And there are specific good works. It seems to me that God created us. I think we're pretty much told this. He created us to do in this world, right? We have specific callings and vocations and what not. And there may well be certain. I'm inclined to think, as something of a voluntarist, not a kind of a radical optimistic voluntarist,
right.
but there's an element of voluntarism in my view, that God may tell me to do something, and it may well become for me something of an obligation, maybe even a moral obligation.
Yeah.
But if you did it, it might be supererogatory. It's not
Mm,
something that you're necessarily called to do. It kind of goes
right.
above and beyond the call of duty. But for me, it might well be my duty. I mean, like we're walking down the street, and there's a homeless person, and in that particular person, in that particular occasion, God speaks to me and says, give that person something, but He doesn't speak to you.
Yeah.
Potentially, because it's an imperfect duty, you're not
Mhm.
obligated in every circumstance. But in that particular circumstance, I may well be, it seems to me, if God speaks to me. And
Mhm.
that has more to do with, God's specific calling on me, and not just something common to the human condition. Again, this is what I mean when I say it's a really complicated picture. There's a lot to this. And especially once you start talking about goodness is very complicated. There's just
Yeah.
a lot to it. There's a lot to it. So we have sort of an intuitive, rough and ready conception of it. And I thought you did a really nice job encapsulating that. But of course, there are also so many nooks and crannies and
Yeah.
nuances and texture to it all. And it's really a topic of a lifetime to study.
Which you have devoted your life to. So, well, you're so encouraging. I just really, I could talk to you all day because you're somebody that you can learn from and be encouraged by. Like I said in the introduction, I think you have a beautiful mind and the heart of a pastor as well. And so that's just a rare combination. And I just really appreciate that about you.
Well, that's sweet. Thank
Yeah,
you, Tim.
you bet. Well, let's get into the moral argument and the objections to the moral argument. There's one called the Euthyphro dilemma, which is kind of the main counter or the main objection to the argument. So, can you tell us tell the audience about the Euthyphro dilemma? What is it?
Yeah. This is sort of the granddaddy of all the
Yeah.
objections, you might say. Right. So in an early Socratic dialogue called the Euthyphro, the Socratic dialogues, you got the early and the middle and the late. So this was an early one. And in the early ones, you're getting Socrates, kind of pure Socrates, you get
Yeah.
Plato more later. So Euthyphro, early Socratic dialogue, this is very much kind of kind of a pristine Socratic kind of view. There are two characters there, Socrates and Euthyphro, and they're at the court. And Euthyphro is suing his own father for having neglected a slave and allowing him to die. And Euthyphro is appalled at this and is suing his own dad.
Hmm.
And Socrates is taken aback by this. And he's, by the way, at the court because he's getting sued or brought to court, right, for not believing in the gods and for corrupting the youth and things like that. So Socrates was great, as you know, at playing ignorant, pleading ignorance. Like, I don't know what justice is, and I don't know what piety is, and whatnot, right? and then he would always kind of needle people and say, "But you do. I bet the poets
Mhm.
and the diplomats and all the rest." And so he says, "Well, to Euthyphro, well, you're suing your own father, so you must have a very clear conception of what
Yeah.
piety is and such, and I don't." And this is, of course, why Socrates claimed that the Oracle of Delphi was right after all. He was the wisest in Athens because, he was ignorant, but at least he knew it. And the others were ignorant and didn't know it. So he knew one more thing than they
Yeah.
did. So he's pushing Euthyphro on this. And Euthyphro was a religious buck. And this is going to be very important. He really firmly believed in all of the Greek gods and all of that. Okay, so Socrates says, "Explain to me the nature of piety and such." And so Euthyphro first says, kind of a definition by ostension, well, it's doing what I do, prosecuting, a wrongdoer. in this case, his father. And Socrates basically said something like, I don't want an example so much as I want what we might put in modern terms, the essential nature of this thing. So explain to me what it is in its essence. So Euthyphro at that point, being heavily religious, punts to the gods, and he says, "Oh, okay, piety is what piety is what the gods love, and impiety is what the gods hate." Then Socrates pointed out that according to all that lore about the Greek pantheon of gods that Euthyphro claimed to believe in, the gods didn't always agree. So he says, what's up with that? So Euthyphro says, okay, no problem. The pious is what all the gods love, and the impious is what all the gods hate. Okay, so that's his third attempt. And at this point, then Socrates pivots a little bit, shifts gears, and raises what has become known as the Euthyphro dilemma. So there are two horns of the Euthyphro dilemma. The one, the non-voluntarist horn, says that God commands something because it's pious. God commands something because it's pious. And in that sense, God really wouldn't be the foundation, or the gods wouldn't be the foundation of piety or morality or anything like that. Rather, the gods would just sort of come along and clue us in, maybe, as to what already is pious. So that's not really going to help the case of the theistic ethicist. You have to endorse, it seems, something like the other horn of the dilemma that says something is pious because the gods love it, or something like that. Now let me switch gears to a modern context. Let's replace talk of the gods with talk of God, and let's instead of the loves of the gods, we'll talk about the will or the commands or something like that.
Yeah.
So now the question becomes: here's the dilemma: does God say command something because it's moral? Or is something moral because God commands it? Okay, if God commands something because it's moral, again, that's non-voluntarism, and that's not going to help the case of the theistic ethicist, right? It really wouldn't put morality under the purview of God, except maybe in some kind of attenuated epistemic sense. The other option, the other horn of the dilemma, is voluntarism, that says something is moral because God commands it. So in virtue of God's commanding something, it becomes moral. Okay. Now, the challenge with that horn of the dilemma, though, and this is why many people think that the Euthyphro dilemma constitutes an intractable obstacle for theistic ethics, is, well, what if God were to command us to torture children for fun or something like that? It makes morality appear to be arbitrary and capricious. Okay, so can you answer that objection as a theistic ethicist? Can you say, well, no, morality does depend on God, but you don't really fall prey to this arbitrariness problem? I think so. Um, if you want me to give you that answer, I'll be happy to do that.
Yeah, definitely want to get that answer. So anyway, you've done a nice job in painting the picture of the Euthyphro dilemma for us. So now tell us, how would you defeat this so-called defeater?
Yeah, the first big observation that I would want to make is look at the difference between Euthyphro's gods and ours. Okay.
Yeah.
So his were like these fickle, capricious deities subject to all the foibles of human beings. We're talking about, in, say, the God of the Bible, a God in whom there's no shadow of turning, a God who is impeccable, a God who is perfectly holy, perfectly good, perfectly loving. And
Yes.
so, right off the bat, arbitrariness problems and issues of caprice are not going to carry the same kind of weight. That doesn't solve everything, but it's a good start.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, reminds me, you can't simply say, "Oh, you can get around this by appealing to God's nature," and stop there. You have to then say, "And God's nature is,"
Right.
because if God's nature were bad, appealing to God's nature wouldn't help at all, right?
Yeah. I like to go straight to 1 John 4:8. God is love.
Yes, that's right. God is love. I think that's
Yeah.
absolutely right.
Mhm.
And there, as a Christian, I think you can especially start to emphasize, if you wish, in the appropriate context, the way in which the Trinitarian understanding of God makes fuller sense of God's being essentially loving. There's powerful stuff to do with that, which just reminds me, by the way, that there's a lot of great, I think, cutting edge work to be done in applying the moral argument, not just to theism, but to Christian theism in particular. A lot of exciting work to be done there.
Yeah.
Okay, so having made that distinction, then let's go back to the dilemma. So which horn of the dilemma do I embrace? Now, now some people say, well, the two horns of the dilemma are not exhaustive. There's a third option because God is the good, right?
Right.
William Lane Craig does this kind of thing, and this way you can sort of slip through the horns of the dilemma. Um, Now that's largely predicated on a theistic Platonic account of God as the good, following
Mhm.
someone like Robert Adams. And I do that myself. I tend to think that that's the right analysis, but I also recognize that not every theistic ethicist is a theistic Platonist in that way. There are theistic ethicists who are natural lawyers and other things. So, although I myself gravitate toward a theistic Platonic account, I'm going to give you a broader solution, and it's also going
Okay.
to have an advantage of not leaving behind the two horns of the dilemma. I'm actually going to stick with those horns and give you a
Mm.
solution.
Okay.
And here's what I do. I divide between the good and the right. And this is a standard distinction, of course, in ethics, right? So one is the issue of values, and the other is the deontic matter of obligations. And basically, I endorse something of a non-voluntarist view with respect to the good and a voluntarist view with respect to the right. So
Nice.
does God command something because it's good? Sure. Yeah. And then, of course, that raises the question, what's your theory of the good? And ultimately, I think God himself is the good.
Mm.
And I think there are principled reasons to believe that. And we argued at length for that in Good God. Uh, so it's not some kind of voluntaristic thing where good is whatever God makes it to be. Instead, you really do start bottom up with your notions of good and you build up. And you
Mm.
eventually realize that God's going to be the best candidate for what the ultimate good is. And then maybe other lesser finite goods or goods are good in virtue of, say, relevant resemblance to the ultimate good or something like that.
Yeah.
So I do that. And then I do, on the other hand, with respect to moral duties, embrace a voluntarist, the voluntarist horn of the dilemma, because I am something of a divine command theorist. That makes perfect sense to me. Built on the foundation of God as the good. Yeah, if God tells me to do something, I think I'm obligated to do it. And does that raise intractable arbitrariness concerns? Well, no, because God is perfectly loving. And
Right.
so there's no way in which he's going to tell me to torture children for fun or something like that.
Mhm.
So contrary to what many say, I think that God actually really well explains certain necessary moral truths because they're rooted in his unchanging character, rather than that dependence relation vitiating the very category or the possibility of necessary moral truths. The wrongness of child torture for fun among them.
Yeah. Yeah. I love how you pointed out that God is perfectly loving. He's also perfectly intelligent. So if he's going to give you, if he issues a divine command, it's based out of perfect love and perfect intelligence that this is actually the best thing to do in this situation. So we can trust him.
That's
We
right. I
ought to.
think, yeah, I think there are different ways to go about answering the question, what gives God this authority? And one of them is to point to his Anselmian attributes.
Mhm.
Yeah, and that's the tack that we took in Good God at one point. And then other people add other insights. John Hare has his own account of God's authority to give us binding obligations, and
Mm.
C. Stephen Evans gives a number of reasons why he thinks it's the case. I think it's just fascinating literature.
Yeah. Wow. All right. So let's bring this back to the moral argument. How does this
Yeah,
connect to the moral argument?
right. Yeah, that's a good question. So the Euthyphro dilemma and the objections that come out of it are directed against this notion of theistic ethics. So if you can, one, defend theistic ethics against these various objections by answering the Euthyphro dilemma and other objections that might arise, and give positive principled reasons to believe in that dependence relation of morality on God, then you have defended theistic ethics and argued for it, and that's an important part of the moral argument. In fact, what I would say is it's about one third of the
Yeah.
moral argument. Then after that, you need to do two other things. You need to argue for some kind of moral realism on which the whole moral argument is predicated. And Jerry Walls and I are writing a book on that topic now. And then you need to critique the alternatives. You need to critique the alternatives. So say non-Christian religious alternatives or secular ethical foundations. If you can argue that those do not provide as good and as robust an explanation as, say, classical theistic or personalist theistic or distinctively Christian theistic accounts of moral foundations, then you're done. And you have the ingredients for an effective moral argument according to which God provides the sort of explanation that you're looking for and that's cried out for when you take moral evidence seriously.
Yeah. All right. So with that said, is there anything else involved in laying out the moral argument?
Yeah, I just included that in that answer. I'm sorry about that,
Oh,
Tim.
okay. That's all right.
So if you wish, you can skip that question.
Did you get that, Graydon? Okay, cool.
Sorry about that.
So now I'm going to go to how many versions. Is that right? Okay. All right. And action. All right. So how many versions of the moral argument are there?
Well, it's a good question. And I don't know any kind of definitive answer, except that there's quite a variety. There's quite a variety depending on what you want to emphasize, and then of course, depending on the extent to which you want to make the case, right? So you might just want to emphasize, objective rights. Objective moral values and duties, right? Like, so William Lane Craig does that. Yeah. And that's great. And you can approach it that way. Or you could talk about, I'm going to talk about moral obligations, moral values, and moral rights. So make a slightly bigger case. Or you could talk about moral obligations, moral duties and values and rights, and moral freedom. Yet another moral phenomena in need of explanation that we talked about before. But there are epistemic versions of the moral argument. There are performative versions. There are ontological versions. There's a whole range. And this raises one interesting question in my mind that I struggle with from time to time, and struggle with in a good way, right? Is there one moral argument, right, with lots and lots of parts? Or are there just a bunch of different moral arguments?
Oh, wow.
And I go back and forth on it. But I will say that maybe what draws me sometimes, at least, to the idea that there really is just one moral argument with lots and lots of different interrelated and moving parts is that the parts seem to cohere so well together to form a whole and a big picture, that really fits, and it all kind of goes together, that it makes me think that, well, maybe the very nature of this organic whole suggests that there really is one cumulative case moral argument. Wow. Where you can put all of these pieces together.
And are you going to formulate that anytime soon?
Well, what I do is I give sort of a fourfold case. So I myself am delimiting, and I don't discuss everything, but there's nothing sacrosanct to my particular approach. And I think really people need to be kind of open to the full range of evidence and really look at the evidence seriously and kind of see where it leads. But I myself only talk about like four things. I think they're important things, but it's not the whole picture.
Okay, so that brings the next question up. I want you to tell us about your version of the moral argument. So how exactly does your four-part moral argument go?
Yeah, so my fourfold case, I talk about first moral facts, included among them, objective moral values and duties, like Craig talks about. But then I also do talk about other things, moral regrets, moral freedom, moral rights, and so forth. There's a whole plethora. I mean, there's a whole range of important moral facts in need of robust explanation. So that's the first of the four prongs. Then moral knowledge, so epistemic variants of the moral argument. And there's some really good work on this by guys like Angus Ritchie, Angus Manouge. Apparently, if your name is Angus, you're going to become an epistemic moral apologist. That's my theory. Let me see, R. Scott Smith, my friend Sloan Lee, and Richard Swinburne and others.
Yeah.
Really cool stuff. The big challenge there, especially nowadays with debunking objections, is how do you account for the coincidence between our moral faculties and these objective moral facts, if such there be out
Hmm.
there? And I think theism
Right.
provides an impeccable explanation for that.
Yep.
In fact, I just got done directing a dissertation by John Fraser on that very topic, and it's
Hmm.
brilliant. I'm sure he's going to publish that down the line. The third prong, well, the third and fourth prongs are what are the two aspects of what John Hare calls Kantian moral faith. One has to do with that issue of grace, right? So our deeply felt existential moral needs for forgiveness, for change, and ultimately for something like perfection.
Mm.
Uh, and so this is the performative variant of the moral argument, and this traces all the way back to Kant, and then Hare more recently has been the one best known for advancing that argument. So that's the third prong in mind, and then the fourth is the second aspect of Kantian moral faith, and this one sounds a little bit more heady, but philosophers at least tend to really like it more. This harkens back to what Reid called the coincidence thesis, what Sidgwick called the dualism of practical reason, and what Kant was concerned about, recognizing that we're both, as he put it, phenomenal and noumenal creatures. If we were purely noumenal creatures, all we care about is, say, to be virtuous, right? We wouldn't care about how happy we are or anything like that if our material needs are met. But we are corporeal, and phenomenal creatures, and we do care about issues like our happiness. We're just hardwired for that,
Yeah.
and it's perfectly legitimate to care about being happy and being fulfilled and being joyous and so forth. And so the essential question here is, does your moral theory make sense ultimately of an airtight connection between something like happiness and holiness? And what's beautiful is that a Christian account of these matters, yeah, gives you an excellent answer to this. That yes, indeed, there is an airtight connection. As we are reconciled to God, as we become the people that we were meant to be, we will find our deepest joy, our
Hmm.
deepest joy. And there is absolutely an airtight connection in that way between happiness and holiness. And our secular friends are really hard pressed to make that case, because almost invariably, if this life is all that there is, there will arise points of disconnect.
Yeah.
And the folks who follow the dictates of morality and whatnot will not end up being the happy or the fulfilled or the
Hmm.
joyous. They may well suffer the most or something like that.
Right.
So yeah, what I'm especially excited about though with the fourfold approach then is not to see all of these as separate, but really then to see them as constituting an organic whole, where you put all of it together. So you have these various moral phenomena in need of robust explanation, all of which points to theism really strongly. You need a robust epistemic account of our moral knowledge. Theism answers that and avoids the debunking objections better than anything else.
Hmm.
And then the two aspects of Kantian moral faith are the happy, the holy, and are there adequate worldview resources here in your ultimate metaethical account to make sense of our deeply felt existential moral needs for forgiveness, for change, and for uh, to be saved to the uttermost, to be perfected ultimately.
Yeah.
Uh, Theism generally, Christianity particularly, answers all four of these impeccably well.
So it sounds like you take more of an abductive approach.
Yes, I do like an abductive approach, and I've argued for this. I've also, pointed out that if other people would prefer a deductive approach or something like that, that's fine, or an inductive approach. Swinburne goes that way. That's fine. That's sort of the general logical structure of the arguments, and that's fun, and that's kind of fun to fiddle around with and have discussions about. But eventually you got to realize, okay, so that's all fine and good, but now let's really dig into that evidence, because that
Yeah.
evidence is exciting,
Yeah.
and God doesn't just want us, to be kind of discussing logical methodology. He really wants us to look at this evidence because it's evidence that he gave us, evidence
Yeah.
that is reflective of who we are, of who he is, of what he intends for us in this world. And yeah, so that needs to be taken with the utmost seriousness. That said, I do like the abductive approach because I think it tends to be very effective at building bridges with our interlocutors,
Yeah.
because we can say, hey, look, we both see certain moral phenomena here, and you can, using the resources of your worldview, can explain some of these things, and
Hmm.
but we can explain more as a theist, because by the
Mhm.
way, all the things that say our secular friends appeal to, all the features of this world and such,
Right.
like the satisfactions of morality and whatnot, we have access to all that stuff too,
Hmm.
and infinitely more,
Right.
by our having been created by a perfectly loving God in his image and for reasons and purposes.
So would you say the Christian theism can explain more, or can we explain all the data?
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure I have my mind around all the data, because the picture is so big.
Right.
Um,
I guess, is there
I,
any piece of information or evidence or data that you're aware of that Christian theism can't explain?
yeah, no, but I would point out something like this. Remember how I mentioned with respect to goodness earlier,
Mhm.
how difficult it is?
Yeah.
Ultimately, as a theistic Platonist, I think that there is something, there are elements of inscrutability with respect to ultimate goodness. So, we see through a glass darkly, right? So
Mhm.
we're the first to admit that we don't have our minds around everything, and sometimes we just get intimations about the ultimate good, of which we have a relatively inchoate awareness and understanding. However, Robert Adams makes a point about this that turns it into a virtue for us as Christians, because we believe that God himself is inscrutable in certain respects,
Mhm.
right? That it's going to take us literally forever to get our minds around God's goodness. And if God is the good, it makes perfect sense that the ultimate transcendent good will forever remain a little bit beyond our ken.
Yeah.
Uh, to say that it will take forever for us to get our minds around God's goodness is to say that it's a process that will never be completed.
That's right. Into the infinite future.
Yeah. So that's not exactly an answer to your question, but
Yeah.
it does remind me that we're saddled with certain epistemic limitations here. I don't know of any intractable objections to a Christian theistic perspective when it comes to morality. And I do think among the various explanations on offer that it provides the best explanation,
Yeah.
of the full range of moral facts
Mhm.
of which we're aware.
Yeah. Just to add on to what you were talking about there, I like to say that, in the new heavens and the new earth, evangelism and even apologetics will come to an end, but theology will never come to an end. We get to learn new things about an infinite God into the infinite future, and that excites me because there's nothing I love more than the study of theology. And so just imagine every day will seem so new in
Yeah.
heaven,
Yeah.
into the infinite future. Every day you wake up and understand something new about God, and our jaws will drop and we'll be like,
Yes.
whoa, wow, that's so cool. And
Yeah.
so,
This
it's not going
actually,
to be boring.
no, this actually really relates to an aspect of moral apologetics. See, Kant gave an argument for immortality that went something like this: we'll never actually achieve the holy will that only God has. So we have to sort of pursue it forever, and we'll only get closer and closer and closer to it.
Mhm.
We'll approach it, like a mathematician might say, asymptotically, but we'll
Okay.
never actually get there. And this is why he thought we had to live forever, because it's a process that would never be completed. Now, I don't think
Interesting.
he's quite right about that,
Mm.
because there is a point at which we'll be entirely conformed to the image of Jesus, entirely delivered from the power of sin. And I
Mhm.
think that we will become something like, impeccable, something
Right.
like a holy will, because God's going to do that by his grace. But there is an element of truth in what he was getting at. So he was wrong about maybe one thing, but I think he was right about something else, and it relates directly to what you were saying, which is even after that state of perfection is achieved, you might say, there will still be growth, and it will be
Right.
infinite growth.
Yes.
So there is a dynamism that I think he had a good intuition about, in the blessed state, that will never go away. And it's a function of the fact that God himself, on my view, and yours, that God himself is the infinite transcendent good, that we'll never get to the bottom of.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And I love that. That makes me happy.
Yes.
I love to learn. Well, it's so cool to see the evolution, as it were, of the moral argument. Can you tell us about the history of the moral argument? Who offered the first version of the moral argument, and where did it go from there?
Yeah. Craig actually argues that the seeds of the moral argument go all the way back to Plato.
Wow.
But usually Immanuel Kant is recognized as the first full-fledged moral apologist. There were precursors, of course, to him in Locke and in Pascal and Reed, Berkeley, Butler, and others. But yeah, he really was the one who began to put it together, and especially his view of the power of authoritative moral duties, a function at the foundation of the moral argument. So there's that. But when I worked on the moral argument for years, and I would occasionally run into someone else from the history, Sorley, oh, who's this guy? And then I'd read a little bit about him. And I was like, yeah, that's cool. And more time would pass. Then I'd run into, Hastings Rashtal did this work. Oh, Hastings Rashtal. So let me read about him. And then A.E. Taylor and so forth. And the list kept getting bigger and bigger. And so at a certain point, I thought, well, maybe I should keep a list,
Yeah.
which I started to do. And then I eventually realized, man, there's not really a full-fledged history of the moral argument that has been written. So Jerry and I kind of took a pause. We were going to write a trilogy. We decided, let's turn it into a tetralogy, and just sort of pause and write a book on the history of the moral argument, which we did.
Yeah.
And John Henry Newman, for example, gave a brilliant version based on conscience. And he thought the moral argument wasn't just an argument that enabled us to know that God exists. He actually thought, employing a different conception of knowledge, that it was a phenomenon that we can have an existential acquaintance with that puts us in touch with God himself. We can know God via following our conscience and stuff. He called the conscience at one point something like the vicar of Christ, a very, very deep existential personalist account of the moral arguments. One of my favorite variants. Of course, Kant gave his famous versions, and they correspond to the third and fourth prongs of my fourfold approach. But A.E. Taylor, his classic work, Newman, his classic work, Grammar of Assent, The Faith of a Moralist is A.E. Taylor's famous work, and Hastings Rashtal and Arthur Balfour, who was a British prime minister, but who went to Oxford and who gave Gifford lectures on the topic and whatnot. And then, of course, in the 20th century, there are so many important thinkers. There's been a real resurgence of interest in moral apologetics. So if you want, I have that book right here, by the way, if anybody's interested. So this is the book, The Moral Argument, A History. Jerry Walls wanted to call it something fancy. And I said, Jerry, let's just call it this. We use these fancy titles and nobody knows what in the world we're even talking about. Let's call it this. Maybe we'll sell 20 copies instead of 15.
So what book are you working on right now?
The fourth in the tetralogy. So now we are doing what should have come first, logically speaking. We're defending moral realism against objections. But like I said before, I may have, back when we wrote Good God, I didn't really see a big need at that time to defend moral realism. But even in the last decade, we've seen an upswing in moral skepticism, even though it remains a distinctly minority view. So I actually think that the timing is nice in that way. And it's also nice to write the logically first book in a tetralogy last, because you know everything else that's coming. And so you can write with all of that in mind.
Oh, yeah.
Kind of tailor the book just right.
Wow. So this is the prequel.
Yeah.
Yeah. Kind of the
right.
origin story or whatever.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. All right. So I think in May, you're going to be doing a class with the WLC, William Lane Craig, right?
Yeah.
You're doing a class with him, right? Down in Houston, right?
That's right.
Okay. So what's that going to be like?
Intimidating for me.
For you?
My main job is to not show that I'm freaking out on the inside teaching a class with William Lane Craig.
Yeah. Oh, I would be, but
I'm going to act very cool.
Well,
and
he's
be
the
like,
one.
this is
I
cool.
believe he's the one that's referred to you as the expert in all things related to the moral argument.
Yeah.
So,
Um, so anyway, yeah, it's going to be fantastic fun, I think. And he'll be teaching the first week. I'll be teaching the second week. I think it's May 17th to 28th, I believe, those 2 weeks. So like I say, from 3 to 5:30 in the afternoon Central Time, and HBU students can take it for credit. But folks who are just anywhere else in the country, if they'd like to take it, they can come to Houston and take it if they want to, as an auditor. Or they could watch it just for a small fee. They can audit the class via Zoom or whatever, Microsoft Teams, whatever we're going to use. I'm not sure.
wow.
So yeah,
I would love to do that.
it should be great
Yeah.
fun, and yeah, it's a great honor to teach with William Lane Craig for sure.
So is there a link that we could share in the notes here on how people
Yes,
could sign up for that?
yes, I'll send that to you.
Great. We'll make sure to share that.
Thank you.
That sounds amazing. So yeah, tell us about the Center for Moral Apologetics at Houston Baptist University.
Yeah, right. So a big reason our coming to HBU is that President Sloan here, when I shared with him a few years ago, my vision for a center for moral apologetics, really believed in it and wanted to bring us as soon as it was, financially practicable to do so. It's a vision that actually goes way back about 15 years. I had this idea of sort of a central research hub uh, geared all around the various dimensions of moral apologetics, where folks can come together in community and work on various aspects of the moral argument
Mm.
together, and do some real cutting edge work and extending the moral argument to Christianity, and just delving into aspects of it that need more attention, and
Ah,
taking on non-Christian religious alternatives when it comes to religious foundations, and spelling out the ways in which, say, Christian theology can impeccably answer debunking objections related to the epistemic variants of the moral argument. But sort of fostering a community, because this really is a job for a community and not just a person, not just a few people. There's so much good work, good cutting edge work to be done. We need a whole community working on this. And so this was sort of the vision for it, and HBU bought into it, and they're giving me this opportunity to construct this center. And if I could just ask that people would pray about it, and of course, if they wish to contribute to it, eventually we want to endow a chair in moral apologetics in perpetuity, the holder of which will run the center long after I've shuffled my mortal coil and the like. And we really want this thing to be around for a good long while, and to become a central research hub on the moral argument, a place that people can come and work in community on these topics, and really make a serious contribution to the church in so doing.
I love that idea. I mean, you're going to have all these scholars that are working on the moral argument, interacting with each other in real time. It's not like you
Yeah.
have to wait for months to get something published in a journal and then have them read it. And, I mean, that just becomes so time consuming. It seems
Yeah.
like you don't get anything done. You guys are going to be all there together, working on this, challenging each other, sharpening each other like iron. And I'm really excited to see what comes out of that. I mean, imagine if there was a center for cosmological arguments and a center for the ontological argument, whatever. I mean,
Right.
so this is just amazing. And I hope it inspires more things like this. So,
Yeah, me too. Very exciting.
yeah. All right. Well, I've got really one more question for you. And this might be the most important, because here at Freethinking Ministries, we love to use movies and pop culture to help people make connections to ultimate reality and to think clearly about God. So, for example, I love to appeal to Doctor Strange and the Avengers to help people understand middle knowledge and mere Molinism. And we've also appealed to the Avengers and even Star Wars to help people see how libertarian freedom is vital for responsibility. So, with that said, what movie would you appeal to in order to help folks grasp the moral argument or objective morality?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, can I talk about a TV show
Sure.
instead of a movie? Yeah.
Yeah, that'll work.
The reason I ask is my wife, Mary Beth, and I just relatively recently wrote a piece on the TV show called The Good Place. The Good Place. And is a really clever comedy. And I think it ran for 4 seasons.
Okay.
And its run is now done. And basically, it's sort of a secularized version of the afterlife. So, these folks, they basically die, and then they find themselves in a particular place. And at first they think they're in the good place, and then it turns out not so much, and whatnot. And then there's a lot of shenanigans that go on, and I don't want to give it all away. But the basic idea of the show is, if you've lived good enough, then you go to the good place, and otherwise you go to the bad place. And this raises, of course, all kinds of interesting questions. And as Christians, of course, we don't believe in something like works righteousness exactly at all, right? We think it's only by God's grace that any of us will end up in the blessed state. So there's neat contrasts to draw along those lines. But the one dimension that we kind of keyed in on our in our paper, and it was published in a book called Good Place in Philosophy.
Really?
With Blackwell.
Okay.
Yeah. So the thing that we emphasized was that, on their view, the highest goods that they could really conceive of was basically stuff like going out to eat and looking at beautiful sunsets and seeing movies and and whatnot, just kind of enjoying themselves, and that's all great stuff. But the idea is, a lot of time passes for these folks in the good place. Eventually they get there, and they do this over and over and over. And eventually they're just sort of satisfied with it all. And then, I hate to give it away, so block your ears if you don't want
Spoiler alert.
want the spoiler.
Yeah.
So what they eventually do is they basically off themselves at the very end, and they're happy about it. We're going to pass into non-existence now, and we're perfectly content. And that's supposed to be the big culmination. But what's so sad about that is that they didn't have a conception of a good big enough to satisfy them forever. And this goes back to what we talked about before, Tim, right? And God is a good big enough to satisfy us forever. We'll never get bored. We'll never, we'll never get tired of it. They'll never reach a point where we say, okay, we've had enough, and now we'd rather just pass into non-existence or something like that. No, God is an infinite good. The ultimate, infinite, transcendent good, who will forever satisfy us. And so yeah, the show was a really powerful example of how secular goods just aren't good enough, because they weren't wrong. You probably would reach a point of, you might say, just malaise or satiation. You'd want it probably just to end if the goods in question were merely finite. But if there is this infinite good that will satisfy us to the uttermost forever, right? Then it is then something like an eternal life makes good sense. And so yeah, it was actually a really neat opportunity to use a piece of popular culture to drive home an important aspect of moral apologetics.
So that show ultimately misses the mark at the end, right?
Yeah, their good was too small.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I'm gonna have to watch that. Never seen it, but I'll take a look. But definitely want to read your paper on it. It's your paper is published already?
Yes, in a book called Good Place in Philosophy. That philosophy and pop culture series, there's a bunch of them now. That started way back when with my buddy Bill Irwin at King's College up in Pennsylvania with Open Court. Then he moved it over to Wiley Blackwell. And now there are a few different series. But it's a great concept, by the way. And it's along the lines of your question of using pop culture to get people excited about some of these questions of, in this case, philosophy, but apologetics or whatever.
That's right. Well, if you could send us that link, we'll make sure to share that too.
Cool.
If you don't mind. So this was a fantastic conversation. I just want to thank you so much for being with us today. Is there anything else that you'd like to say before we go?
No, just it was a real honor. I so appreciate your work, Tim, and I really enjoyed this with this time with you. God's blessings on you.
Well, thank you so much. Just please keep up the great work. You're always welcome here at Freethinking Ministries, and I look forward to interacting with each other more in the future. And to those of you watching this video, hey, if you like what you saw here today, well, please like this video and share this video. And most importantly, please subscribe to our channel, ring that bell so you don't miss future interviews like this one. And this was an awesome interview. You don't want to miss these. So with that said, stay tuned. And in the words of the prophet Isaiah, come, let us reason together, says the Lord. See you next time.